Hola clase. So I'm going to try and help you make a distinction between cultural bias and culturally loaded when referring to test assessments or test items. There is a chapter 10 from this book you have on PDF, Assessing Culturally Linguistically Diverse Students. Chapter 10 attempts to make a distinction about that, but they approach it from the very traditional perception about cultural bias. This traditional perception is the one from psychometricians, where cultural bias is a characteristic, and in the book they're doing it for cognitive intelligence tests. That's how they explain it. In where what they say is that every test in and by itself is a cultural event. So the way they explain cultural bias is that any test given in the United States in and by itself is a cultural event. And so mainstream populations may be familiar with what a test means, how it's taken, the structure of questions, this and that, but other populations of students may not. Therefore, there is a bias. A bias traditionally also from the psychometrics perspective. Psychometrics are test developers, psychometricians, test developers, psychometrics, the science behind it. Cultural bias is also a characteristic of after the fact. That is, say you have a well-defined population of Anglo students and a well-defined population of Latino immigrant students, and then you give them a test and you see how a particular population of the two groups, say the Anglo group, performs much better than the other group. You could then argue that the test is culturally biased, that it favors the mainstream culture. These are traditional ways of understanding bias. Now, I have a little bit of a spin for explaining cultural bias and culturally loaded. Cultural bias, to me, it implies a philosophical approach. And culturally loaded is a form of bias. Bias is a bigger umbrella, but culturally loaded refers to the actual test or test items itself. It is a characteristic of the item itself, or the content, of the construct of the item. Let me give you a couple of examples, as I understand it. Say, we know we have assessments for our English language learners that have pictures. And so you ask them to say the word of the picture they see. And in this picture, they see a faucet, a tap, a spigot, a water tap. And it's one of those that we have in American homes that are outside the house on the wall where you can hook up your hose. Well, and then you ask the student to name what they see. And it's a faucet or a spigot or a tap. But this is a type of water tap that is not typical in many other cultures. This is not, houses in many countries and continents don't have a water hose, a water tap to hook up your hose to. So in a sense, to me, that's an item that's culturally loaded. There is no evil intention behind it. Nobody's saying that this tap is better or worse than any other tap. But what we're saying is, if you haven't been to the United States, it doesn't matter how much English you know, you wouldn't be able to identify what you see because it's completely alien to you. That's a culturally loaded item. A culturally biased test assessment or a culturally biased item is one where behind the test there is a philosophical approach that says this is important culture to know and understand, and it's biased. It favors that culture to other cultures. Say, for example, an ECE literacy assessment. You want to see how well the student writes in English. And you ask him or her, the student, to write about George Washington. Well, if what you're trying to do is to test the English proficiency, the writing proficiency, then you will get a more meaningful, practical, and more full, real example of the English ability or their ability to write in English if you let the students write about a free topic, whatever they feel like they can write about. Then you can get a real assessment of what they know in English. But if you ask them about George Washington, you're asking them to know a specific cultural event. You're favoring American history. You're telling them that it's important that they know about George Washington, which is true. You're in the United States, you may want to know about George Washington in your history or social studies class, but not in your English literacy class. You may want to embed it in your English literacy class with some readings, but then it has to be done in the classroom. Okay, sorry about the interruption. This was the interruption. So anyway, so yes, nobody's saying that immigrant students shouldn't know about George Washington, but what we're saying is that if it's an English assessment, how are you going to get the best and more meaningful and more realistic sample of the English capacity? It may not be if you bias or prefer a cultural event over others. That to me is a cultural bias event. And culturally loaded may be a test that doesn't imply any kind of cultural superiority, but at the same time, the test itself is culturally loaded. It's full of American information that, unless you're very Americanized, you may not perform as well as your mainstream populations. All right, I hope that helps. That's how I understand culturally biased versus culturally loaded. And see you soon. Adios.